So I'm Joe Krupnick, Dr. Krupnick, run the Krupnick approach. We are an educational consulting and test prep company. We do a lot of work with students on college programs, including college essays, college selection, thinking about this sort of college probability modeling, recommendation assistance, interview assistance. Essays are probably the biggest, but of course, also things like ACT, SAT prep, academic coursework. And so we take students kind of from conception to completion through this process, fully integrated college prep service. But today I wanted to talk about one of the big strategic questions here. We usually think about this college process in terms of three different elements. Like we think about it in terms of 1, discovery, 2, strategy and positioning, and 3, requirements. And this is really the strategy positioning side. I mean, there's a little bit of discovery in here too, because obviously if you're applying early decision, you want to be applying to one of the schools that is high on your list, as opposed to a school that, is not, I guess, right? So I've called this to ED or not to ED. That is the question, in deference to Hamlet, of course. I also have a little quote at the bottom here, which I think some people have seen. I put it up. Actually, we have an old date up here, but it isn't what we don't know that gives us trouble. It's what we know that ain't so. And I think the idea with that is that one of the biggest things about this process, which I think is really challenging, is that sometimes when you have a test, when you're studying for a test in school, right? When you're taking a math test, you know everything that's on the test. Like you know the range of subjects, and you know like what you have to study in order to get a test to get a good grade. I mean, now if you don't get a good grade, it might not have anything to do with not studying very much. It might be completely to do with that, but it might have to do with a lot of other things, of course, too. But at least you know when you take a math test. Or you take a test. Actually, the ACT, SAT is similar. When you take the ACT, SAT, you know what's going to be on the test. You know precisely what's going to be on the test. This is a little different, right? The college process is very different because you don't know what you don't know. That they don't telegraph. Most colleges don't telegraph to students precisely what you need to do in order to get in. And that has been going on for many years, but it has gotten much more complicated over the last 5 years due to the sort of the holistic admissions revolution, which we can talk about later. And it's also always been shrouded in some mystery because colleges want to be able to make decisions about who they want to take without having to be beholden to anybody. The affirmative action shifts are going to probably intensify this debate, right, about what kind of students should be accepted and what students should be accepted, what students should not be accepted. And colleges are going to increasingly, I think, cling to their own models, which I think they have every right to. But the result of that is that unlike a test you're taking in school, unlike the ACT, unlike a lot of things where you have a full detailed sort of list of the things that you need to do in order to do well, you don't have that. So there's a kind of blindness to this, right? There's a set of expectations or probabilities, but you cannot narrow it down to precise numbers. Ultimately, I mean, we can get there pretty close, but there's always a certain amount of uncertainty in this process. I think our job is to do a lot of things. So our job is partly to decrease that uncertainty, to demystify the process, and to make it as predictable and smooth as it can possibly be. That is from both the student's perspective and the parent's perspective, because this is unlike a math test, the student is involved, which the student is involved entirely independently. The parents are, you guys as the parents are involved in this process to a much greater extent usually than you are in, say, helping a student prepare for like a reading test or something. Partly because there's money on the line, partly because there's scholarships at stake, and partly because this is your kid that you've raised for all these 18 years, and now suddenly they're about to go out into the world and have an independent life, and so there's all this complexity around this, and ambivalence and joy, pride, and all of those things associated with it. So this is a bilateral process that involves everyone. Usually the way that we think about this is that there are four big areas in which we help our students. One is we help our students with requirements for getting into college. So by that, we mean academic coursework, grades, helping students increase their, get their grade point average as high as they can, ACT, SAT prep, AP exam prep. Well, wait a minute. You probably are saying, well, ACT, SAT prep, and AP test exams are also, both of those are not required, right? Well, okay, fine. They're not technically required, but de facto they are in a lot of cases. These are part of political movements again, and right now, to have the best chance you can have, you probably should think of these tests as being as close to requirements as possible. Our rule of thumb with the ACT and SAT is that, and with the APs actually as well, with the ACT, SAT, is that if you were above the 25th percentile for a given college, you should submit. If you were above a 3 on an AP, you should submit. If you are not, then it's probably not worth submitting. And I think this applies to broadly to schools, not just to Ivy League schools, not just to the most selective schools, but it applies to schools across the country. So we help students with that part of it. Discovery is the second part. So discovery involves helping students figure out what they actually want to do. So there are 3 parts of this. One part is discovery is, what are you interested in? So for younger students, often this involves helping students think about what sorts of extracurricular activities they want to get involved with, the kind of things that they want to do outside of school. The things that you do outside of school are immensely more valuable than the things you do inside of school for the most part, especially in organizing kind of nucleus for college. But discovery also involves things like thinking about which kind of colleges you want to attend and what kind of culture and what kind of college, these colleges have different kind of cultural models, right? Cultural norms. And while they may not be as vastly different from each other as sometimes they are perceived to be, there's really a big difference between going to like a Bates college and going to a Northeastern in Boston. I mean, there's a completely different kind of cultural experience of going to school in an urban area, going to school in a less urban area, going to school with 15,000 people, going to school with 1,500 people, having professors teach you directly, being taught by graduate students, but having access to all this world-class research. So there's a culture, and each of these schools has a different culture. And so that's part of the discovery process. Strategy positioning is what we're going to talk about today. It involves essays, college consulting and activities, probability modeling, and just as important in some ways in this whole process, how to think about early decision, early action, and regular decision. That I want to move to in a second. Financial aid is the 4th part of where we are helping students find get access to scholarships, both private scholarships and university scholarships. We have this big data bank, and we have contacts in some of our actual top tutors who are former admissions officers themselves at Harvard and Yale and Princeton and Duke and Michigan and places like that. They help us think through some of these things and strategize through some of these things, including how to think about financial aid and scholarships. And that actually enters in a little bit into the early decision question, much less than I think people perceive, but it does. The scholarship or the financial aid element is implicated in the early decision question a little bit that we can also discuss. So our track record, 93% of our students are accepted into at least one of their top 3 schools. That I think we're by far the best, track record of anybody in the area. That's all on our website. I mean, the purpose of this is not to brag about our success. We've had a lot of great success with students. Outcomes last year were especially good, but let's get right into today's topic. So this is what we're really talking about. And this is the sort of, this is what we're doing. This is a series. And so today we want to focus home in on the early action, early decision question, which is a pretty faithful one. Okay, so topics for today's webinar. 1, old versus new paradigm of admissions. It would be disingenuous to suggest that the paradigm has not changed. This is actually part of the not knowing what you don't know phenomenon. That it very often is the case that more educated parents and parents who come from environments where they went to Ivy League schools themselves or from PhD programs are actually a lot of parents who come from very educated backgrounds are actually in a weaker position in some ways to help their students than parents who do not come from these backgrounds. And the reason is that there's a real temptation, a real risk of falling into complacency. That there's the expression, just enough to be dangerous, where you can also know too much to be too much to not be dangerous. And if you think you know too much about this process because of the way that it existed 20 years ago, it's very, very possible that you will make some major mistakes here because the process has changed tremendously. Next, what does it mean to apply early versus regular? That's the topic again. That's what we're focusing on. early action, early decision, thinking about the timeline and when you want to apply, then the ED versus NEA advantage versus regular decision, which is, I think, what the main theme is here today. What are the arguments for doing EAED? What are the arguments against it? What are the statistics look like? What are the more qualitative factors look like? Well, okay, so this is how college admissions used to look. This is the college admissions of the generation that I come from, or maybe a little bit earlier. Very warm and cuddly. Everybody's happy. Obviously, this is a naive, as most forms of nostalgia are. It is a misleading one. We tend to remember things as better than they actually were, and as easier than they actually were. That's just all the psychological studies that suggest that, but it was easier. It was a lot easier. And today it looks like something out of the Bosch painting, The Garden of Earthly Delights, which is on as always, the triptych is over at the Prado in Madrid. It's a lot harder than it used to be. So everybody knows that. What does all of that mean? Well, all right, here is a paradigm now versus 20 versus 30 years ago, 20 years, 30, 40 years, or whatever. Okay, now versus late 20th century. Well, the biggest change, if you look on the right side, well, and everybody can see this, right? By the way, everyone can see that. You guys can see the PowerPoint. Yes. Well, okay, yes. Okay, thank you. Okay, so the criteria for admissions to top schools has changed. And this is I think this is part of why we're having this conversation in the first place. You wouldn't need to be as strategic as you have to be if admissions rates were the way they were before, as you see on the left side, and if the composition or the criteria were more similar to the way they existed pre-COVID. So if you look at the admissions rate, I mean, this is just Harvard, for example, but I mean, actually, this is amazing. I didn't even realize, is this possible? That 90% of applicants were, that seems hard to believe, actually, were admitted to Harvard in the 1940s. That seems high. I mean, that seems high. I've seen this statistic, this graph before. Most colleges have seen admissions rates decline by about 80%. So University of Chicago had an admissions rate of 50% in the 1990s. Now it's it's below 10%. It's actually much below 10. So University of Chicago is more than 80%. Penn used to have an admissions rate of 40%. Now it's at 7 or 8%. University of North Carolina used to have an admissions rate that was close to 50%. Now it's more like 20%. So the state schools have not seen declines that are quite the same as other schools. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the state schools have not gotten correspondingly more difficult. The other part of this is that the criteria have changed, right? So the old paradigm was everything was about grades and test scores, right? You could basically say, okay, if you had a 4.0, if you had a 4.3 from an Ignatius and a 1570, you would be guaranteed to get into one of these schools on the upper left side of this list. Absolutely, I mean, you could write an essay. Your essay could be fine. It would be, you have to say something that's not embarrassing. You'd have to write an essay that would be better than the old John F. Kennedy essay that he wrote when he was applying to college. But you could get into one of these top schools. That's the old paradigm. Now it's not the case at all. I mean, now the weighting has really gone from 60% of the application to about 40%, and 40% is generous. It might even be less than 40%. Now it used to be that academics were necessary and sufficient. Now they are necessary but insufficient. So now what academics do is they get your foot in the door. They get you a seat at the table. They get you into the poker table. They get you into the room. But for the most part, and this is true at any of the schools that are so-called in the top 200 or whatever, top 150, that they do not get you into these schools by themselves. And that means that these other characteristics become more important during this new era. So the personal side is the part that's taken on the greatest significance, college essays and recommendations being the most important of all. Personal, again, these are conservative estimates. So personal characteristics are probably twice as important as they are now relative to the way they used to be. And it's not just that they're more important, it's also that the standards of excellence for these personal things, the personal characteristics of the college essays are higher. So it's not only that that it's worth putting in more time on the college essays, because they're more important, but it's also because in this, elaborate game theoretical model that everyone's playing, everyone is taking them more seriously. And if everyone takes them more seriously, it puts pressure on you to take them more seriously. Activities and athletics have probably not changed much in terms of interest or criteria. Colleges have had roughly the same number of recruited athletes and a number of slots that they're filling for recruited athletics now that they did 25, 30 years ago. I mean, in some ways, this is actually part of the problem, that as the population of college applicants has expanded with kind of this increasing international focus and increasing numbers of students coming from outside of America applying. And as the Common App has proliferated the entire, American ecosystem, students are applying to more students are applying, number one, and students are applying to more schools too. So you have two mathematical features which are driving admissions rates down. Now, one thing that's not happening though is that if they're not what's not happening is they are not expanding their class size. So colleges are not making a corresponding shift in the number of students that they admit. So obviously, these two factors, the increasing number of applicants and the increasing number of students applying from outside, could lead to a corresponding increase in the class size. But it hasn't really done that for the most part. For certain schools, there's a slight increase, small increase in class size, but we haven't really seen it across the board, or we haven't seen it in a major sort of serious way writ large. Activity, so that means athletics we're looking at basically the same sort of slot that we were looking at before. Demonstrated interest has gotten a lot more important. Demonstrated interest is especially important when you're looking at your safeties. It's ironically that more demonstrated interest has become more important for your safeties than it has been for your higher level, for your top choices. And I guess it's not ironic. I mean, it's not ironic for two reasons. One is that if you're applying early decision, everyone knows that it's your first choice. You still should demonstrate interest, but you're demonstrating interest just in as much as the fact that you're applying early decision. The other thing is that sort of higher rank, the schools that are closer to the top of your list are probably more likely to be the more selective schools, and the more selective schools are going to be less insecure or have less. They're going to be more confident that you would matriculate if you were to be admitted, right? So this is where demonstrated interest becomes an extremely important feature or factor for when you're thinking about your safeties, and when you're thinking about, and to a certain extent when you're thinking about some of the state schools. But for safeties, this phenomenon of yield protection, right? So we have three students who are going off to Harvard this year, and two of them did not get into Boston University. One of them did not get into Wisconsin. One of them did not get into Miami. And then they got into like a bunch of other Ivy League schools, like Columbia and Dartmouth and places like that. So remember that these colleges have algorithms that are even more sophisticated than anything that we could come up with. And when they look at your student, it's the phenomenon of being overqualified. And so what yield protection amounts to is that they can look at their statistics and they can say, okay, well, this student is a 4.1 and a 1470. Well, nobody with a 4.1 and a 1470 has ever chosen to come to our school before. They don't want to be the second or third pick at the draft, or the second or third choice for the prom. They want to be number one. They want to be confident that there's a pretty good likelihood that you would show up and matriculate. So this is a major thing. So that means that for safeties, it becomes really important to show them how interested you are, that you should treat your safeties like your top choices, and at least have one or two safeties. Then you can convince them, and then you can convince yourself that you'd be happy to attend. So the next slide is this sort of timeline. And I think that the thrust of the story around college admissions is that the college admissions process has become less humane, but more human. So it's more human in the sense that colleges are looking at humanistic qualities. They're looking at the applicant as a human being, as a whole person, rather than as some sort of ablated, truncated statistical mechanism that they can feed into their data system. Now, they do sort of do that as well have formulas that mechanize the humanistic quality. But that's probably a topic for another conversation, another meeting. They make formulas out of everything, including the humanistic side of this. But nevertheless, there is a major component which involves things like colleges are really looking now on 3 different criteria, right? There are 3 criteria that colleges are using when they're accepting a student. So number 1 is academic preparedness. So are you going to make good use of the academic resources they have at this school? After all, a college is a school. It is primarily a learning environment. No matter what your students might come home and say, at least they think of themselves primarily as educational institutions. So academic qualifications are always going to be important. Second, and I don't think this is a sequencing either. This is just the three most important things, but not in any particular order. Second would be the putative contribution that you might make to the school. And by putative, I mean they're extrapolating, they're imagining, okay, this person with this profile, what kind of contribution will this person make? What kind of contribution intellectually? What kind of contribution socially? What kind of contribution morally? And also to a certain extent, what kind of contribution will you make after you graduate? So that's why you got to be careful about certain kinds of red flags, certain kind of aggressiveness. I mean, they don't want to be thinking the contribution that you make should not be that you got kicked out for holding up a convenience store or something on campus. Like the contribution you want to make is going to be a positive contribution. And so there's also the negative part that you want to be very careful that you're hedging against the possibility that they might see certain things. Mental health, for that reason, is a very tricky thing to talk about on college admission applications and essays. Mental health is one of those areas in which the rule of thumb is you want to say whatever it is that you're talking about regarding any form of, actually really any form of health for that matter, is something that was a challenge, but a challenge that you have overcome to the extent that they don't have to worry about you. They cannot legally discriminate against you on those grounds, but it's sort of the thing to be careful about. So contributions is how are you going to, what kind of mark are you going to leave when you graduate? And then to a certain extent, what kind of things are you going to do when you graduate that'll make their school look good, or that will add to their cachet or their reputation in whatever way. Third criterion is how are you to fit in? How do you fit into the school, right? Cultural fit. Like, do you have the kind of way of thinking, presentation style, sense of humor that we think of our university as possessing? Now, there's a lot of guesswork involved in this. I mean, it means that there's a lot of guesswork involved that the admissions committee is doing. A lot of guesswork involved in thinking about what you're like, but also a lot of guesswork involved in thinking about what they're like. Because defining a school on the ground at the cultural level is very hard to do. It's a little easier when you're talking about arts and sciences programs, but if someone were to say, what is the culture of Northwestern? I mean, that's a very tough question. I mean, I would say there are many cultures of Northwestern. But they still have a sense of what they're like. They have a sense of who they are. And so you want to try to see if you can think about what that is. And when you're applying, this is where the intersection of strategy and positioning and discovery comes in, that you want to find a school that is a good fit for you. So ideally, you want to be in your, as you're moving through junior year and this summer of after junior year, you want to be doing really 4 things starting after junior year. Junior year, you want to get your standardized tests out of the way. You want to have a college list. You want to expand your activities. You want to have as many leadership opportunities as you can, and you want to get good AP scores. The summer after junior year is where the direct process, the direct involvement with the college application begins. And there's sort of 4 things you want to be doing. Whether or not you're applying early decision. One, actually not whether or not, assuming you're applying early action this summer. One is you want to have a draft of your personal statement after the summer personal statement done after the end of the summer. 2 is you want to finalize your EAED list. 3 is you want to have supplements for your EAED schools. And 4 is you want to have your recommendation materials ready so that your recommenders can use them, can make use of them. Ideally, you want to have an even split between target reaches and safeties. And usually we recommend, about 20 to 25 schools. I would go err on the side of more rather than fewer, because as we will discuss, regular decision, the correlation of admissions to regular decision schools is extremely low. So you often can play a probability game with some of the regular decision applications and sort of raise the likelihood of getting into somewhere really good or somewhere that you really might want to go. So what does it mean to apply early? Now, the meat of this. Well, all right, there are different kinds of applying early. And you guys probably know this, so we can talk pretty quickly through it. We have restrictive early action, we have early decision, we have early action, and we have essentially regular decision, right? So restrictive early action is not binding. You cannot apply restrictive early action to a school. Restrictive early action, if you apply restrictive early action, you can only apply to early action, for the most part, state schools. You cannot apply to, for the most part, private schools that have early action programs. So restrictive early action is in some ways more restrictive than early decision, because even though it isn't binding for, at least for the most well-known restrictive early action schools, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, you cannot apply to any other school early action except for state schools. Early decision is binding. So early decision means you're applying, you can choose one school to apply early. If you get in, they expect you to go. They expect you to withdraw all of your other offers from other schools. But you can also apply to schools early action. So if you're applying to, let's say you wanted to go to Dartmouth early decision, well, you could apply to the University of Chicago early action. But if you're applying to Princeton, you cannot apply to the University of Chicago. University of Chicago has a non-restrictive early action program. So does USC. So does University of Virginia. Most of the state schools have non-restrictive early action programs, and you can actually apply. For those, you can apply to through restrictive early action or early decision. But it's the private schools that have early action programs that limit you on the restrictive early action. So what does all this mean? Well, all right, November 1st to November 15th, that's when early decision, early action is submittable. This is why you want to have your list for early action, early decision prior to your list for regular decision. What we usually suggest, the guidance we usually give is have your drafts or your supplements for early action, early decision schools done by the end of the summer. You don't need to have your supplements for your regular decisions done by the end of the summer. In fact, you don't even have to have your list completely finished by the end of the summer, because what's going to happen is when you shift into November 1st to January 1st phase, after November 1st, then you can use your early decision, early action essays as templates for your regular decision schools. And that's one of the things we're really expert at, because basically if you're applying to 25 schools, you cannot write 75 essays. I mean, Balzac couldn't write 75 essays for college, or Montaigne. None of these people could write 75 essays if they had to in the amount of time that they're given for college. So you have to write 7. So you want to find 7 transcendent essays that are terrific, and then you adapt them. And one of the things that one of our areas of strength is, which we're very good at, which will help your student go through this process much more efficiently, is to figure out how to shape and shift and adapt and mold and accommodate in order to kind of make these essays templates for other essays so that they can be applied to some of the other schools that you're applying to when you're applying regular. So November 1st to November 15th, that's the big early date for early decision and early action. January 1st, around January 1st, we're looking at regular decision and we're looking at early decision too, which I haven't mentioned yet. So there are 2 big dates. One is the November 1st to November 15th date. The other is the January 1st date. And with January 1st, we're looking at early decision 2 and regular decision. And this means that early action and early decision schools will usually get back to you in late December. They'll get back to you before you apply for regular decision. Regular decision schools and early decision 2 schools. Early decision 2 schools actually typically get back to you a little bit early. Regular decision schools typically don't get back to you until April. So you've got a long ways to go if you apply regular decision. Some students just will apply early decision or early action just so they know they have some schools that they're definitely, that are definitely possible for them to go to. So let's talk about the next thing, which I think is probably why you guys are here, the early decision or early action advantage. Okay, so we look at these numbers. Well, it looks these are just some examples of schools. And you can look at any schools and there's going to be any school that is an early decision is going to have a much higher rate of acceptance for their early decision process than their overall acceptance rate is. There is no school in the country that has an early decision acceptance rate that is lower than their regular decision acceptance rate. What you are paying for, the price you pay for applying early, is that you've selected one school. The price you have paid for applying early is the opportunity cost of not applying early to another school. And the price you have paid is that if you get in, you're supposed to go. So that buys you a pretty big margin of percentage and a pretty big increase in the percentage odds. It buys you, in many cases, the odds are actually twice or three times as high, the raw odds. In most colleges' for most colleges, more selective schools, there will be at least a 2-to-1 advantage in an acceptance rate or early decision versus regular decision. So prima facie, that means apply early decision. Find a school that's your first choice, and a school that if you really like a school a lot and you think your odds are 20%, 25% or something like that getting in, it could theoretically make a big difference. Usually with our guidance, we suggest that there are two important features about applying early decision besides the statistics part of it. One is that you should only apply to a school early decision if you think it really is your first choice, because you don't want to have a situation occur where suddenly you get into Columbia, and then you actually would prefer to go to Boston University, and you get into Boston University later, or would have, and you can't go to your first choice school because you got into your early school. So number one is apply to a school that's your number one choice. Number two, the other part of this that's important is you probably should apply to school early decision where the range, your estimated range, is somewhere between 15 and 40% of getting in. Now, how do you know what your odds are? Well, that's where our probability models are helpful. That's where things like Naviance is helpful, Maya Learning, Score. I wouldn't even think about applying to schools without having all the scattergram information from Naviance, especially if you're going to want to do this strategically and think about early decision and early action. So it looks from the face of it that early decision gives you a huge edge. Well, okay. The raw numbers, when you look at we have early decision, we have early decision 2, and we have early action, right? The raw numbers seem to suggest that early decision gives you a 2-to-1 edge, or a little higher. Early decision 2 gives you about a 1.75 to 1 edge. And early action gives you about a 1.2 to 1 edge. But let's actually talk about what that really means. Because as I'm going to argue, I think spend as much time as possible arguing this, because I think it's a very important point. The advantage of early decision and early action for that matter, but mainly early decision, the advantage of early decision over regular decision has been vastly overstated. Early decision is a very useful tool. Early decision, net of everything else, early decision is absolutely going to help your admissions odds. There's no question about it. Nobody would ever argue. Again, nobody's going to try to argue that applying early is going to decrease your odds. But the magnitude of the difference is much lower than I think is often argued, is often perceived. So most people, when they look at these numbers, they say, okay, so I'm going to give you a case study. So this is the Brown 2021 case study. The graduates, I think 2021 graduates of Brown. So we've been 2021 graduates from high school who are entering Brown. Okay, so at the time, so this is a few years ago. So at the time, the admissions rate for early decision at Brown was 21.9% versus 6.9% early decision. Okay, fine. So you're 3 times more likely to get in if you go early decision than if you apply regular decision, right? Not necessarily. So it turns out that difference, which amounts to 649 students. So the difference between 21.9% and 6.9% would mean that there would be 649 students who are applying early, 649 additional students who would be getting in early relative to like a regular decision model, right? 649 more students would get in early than would be expected based on the regular decision model. Okay, but of those additional 649 students who would get in early, 200 of them are recruited athletes. So a third of the difference between regular decision and early decision is accounted for by the recruited athlete component of this. The admissions rate for recruited athletes, really by recruited athletes, I mean tier 1, tier 2 athletes who are given a warm embrace and told that essentially are given a likely letter very early These students are admitted at a very, very high rate, not 100%, but close in some cases, for some of the tiers. So a third of the difference between regular and early is attributable to the athletes. Then we have a couple of other things that are a little bit smaller. We have things like, so 8.7% of the early decision students came through scholarships like QuestBridge. 1% of the early decision students came from musical recruits. Certain percentage withdraw. When you net out these things and you do a comparison of the early decision admissions rate and the regular decision admissions rate, when you remove, in other words, when you remove athletes, when you remove people who are musical recruits, and you remove people who are on these scholarship programs where they're already guaranteed a certain percentage of admissions, the new net acceptance rate for early decision for Brown goes down from 21.9% to 14.3%. Now, that's still double the rate, right? That's a lot lower. So 14.3% is still a major advantage for applying early versus applying regular, but it's a much smaller advantage. Now, what hasn't been factored into this are other features, which I think could bring the admissions rate much below 14.3%. One of those is that legacy students, legacy families tend to be much more likely to apply than non-legacies, and donors tend to be much more likely to apply than non-donors. So if you're looking at a school where 10% of the students are coming from through the development office and getting assistance because their family, invested in the college, that group of students is also going to have a much higher admissions rate than the average student. So the 14.3% is going to be overstating the difference between the early decision and regular decision. My guess is something like 10%. The statistic that we've done some statistical analysis to really work through the difference between early decision and regular decision. What does the actual difference amount to? And what we've arrived at is when you hold everything constant, like when you hold and control for athletes and minorities, and athletes and legacies and donors, and you control for some of the students who are more likely to apply early, the difference is about 1.6 to 1. So you increase your odds by about 60% by applying early. So it's not 2 to 1, it's not 2.2 to 1, it's more like 1.6, which is a big difference, but it's not as big of a difference. So it means that if your odds are 30%, your odds shoot up not to 60%, but more like 45% or something, 47%, whatever. So that is really important to keep in mind. With that being said, there are some schools where the early decision difference is bigger than others. And this is also worth noting. Now, there's a certain extent to which we don't want to really delve too much into the micro level details about this thing. But if you want to look at what are your best early decision options, just based on the statistical differences between early and regular. This is actually not net advantage, really more as like the gross advantage. So Tulane, your odds of getting into Tulane, the admissions rate at Tulane early decision is 8.5 times as high as regular decision. If you have a student who's thinking about Tulane, if you have a student who's even considering Tulane, make sure that they, under no uncertain terms, are applying early, either early action, early decision, or potentially early decision too. Regular decision at Tulane is harder to get into than Stanford. I mean, it's pretty much. I mean, it's actually in some ways it really is hard to get into Stanford because they wouldn't accept a student that Stanford would admit. But it's almost impossible to get in regular to Tulane. Dartmouth is 6.3 to 1. Northeastern is 6 to 1. Barnard 4.8 to 1. Northwestern 4.8. Bayes 4.3. Middlebury 4.2. Vanderbilt 4. These are all schools where the net advantage, if you would remove the athletes, remove the legacy donors, to remove the scholarship students who are on particular forms of scholarships that are ED ones, the advantage would be probably closer to, with the exception of Tulane, the advantage would probably be closer to 2 to 1. It would be closer to what it looks like for the other schools, for these particular schools. But remember, on average, the advantage is going to be about 1.6 to 1, holding everything else constant for early decision versus regular decision. Okay. And there are some schools, by the way, where the REA schools tend to confer a much smaller advantage than the ED schools. So again, there's a big difference in the admissions rates when you look at Harvard. I think it's like 7% versus 2% or 3%, but almost the entire difference can be explained by those students with hooks. I just read a story that 43% of students who are at Harvard are either a recruited athlete, a legacy, or a donor. I think it's those three categories. 43% are in one of those categories. That means that, and those categories all have admissions rates that are much higher than for students who are unhooked. Yeah, it was just, yeah, remarkable. It was that. So it was legacies, donors, and athletes are the three big ones. And that was not even early decision. 43% of the students have those qualities. At least one. So REA tends not to confer a major advantage though. So if you apply to Harvard, you have Princeton, Stanford, REA, not a huge difference. I would say that probably is also true for places like Notre Dame and Georgetown. Notre Dame and Georgetown are also REA, don't confer much of an advantage. In fact, I mean, I think the REA acceptance rate for Notre Dame may, when you don't net it out, is actually REA acceptance rate might even be lower at Notre Dame than the regular decision admissions rate is, which is very striking. Okay, so we talked about early decision. The net difference of applying early versus applying regular is not as dramatic as it appears to be, but it is still somewhat dramatic. Okay, we have early action and we have early decision too. So what are we going to do with those things? Well, early action. So early action is November 1st to November 15th. Most state schools have early action. Some private schools have early action, some do not. It's very idiosyncratic. It's very unpredictable. A lot of the schools that, it's hard. It's actually very hard to say based on there's no sort of single characteristic which defines early action schools more than others. But there's some things that are important about early action, and I think that the state schools are definitely the most likely early action scenarios, probably for most of your students. So early action confers a net advantage of about 1.25 to 1, 1.2, 1.25. There are some schools where the advantage is bigger, and there's some schools where the advantage is smaller. The advantage is bigger at Michigan. Michigan loves early action students. I mean, I think the more selective schools, there may be a slightly bigger advantage. Wisconsin also, there's somewhat of an advantage. University of Illinois, not a big advantage for the most part. But the advantage is sufficiently large that, and the trade-offs are sufficiently small, like the cost of applying to schools early action are sufficiently small that the guidance that we give is to apply to schools early action if you can, to apply to as many schools early action as are permitted or legal, and apply to as many schools early action as you can, as time will permit. So in other words, as many essays as you can do for early action schools, because an early action school for the most part you'll have a little bit of an admissions edge. And there's no commitment, you've got no downside of applying early action, except for the fact that it's early. The only downside would be, there are 2 or 3 little downsides. So one downside of applying early action would be if you need more time to write your essays and you think your essays could be stronger if you wait another 2 months. Okay, that's reasonable. Second early action, advantage of not applying early action would be if your grades are a little bit low and you want your first semester grades to be reflected in your transcript to colleges. That would also be a big difference. I mean, maybe not a huge difference, but to the extent that 1/8 of your academic, or 1/7 or whatever, your academic profile will be represented in the regular decision and not represented in the early decision, that might make something of a difference. A third reason to not apply early is if you're late-ish on the ACT/SAT. So if you don't have a score that's submittable by October, then you're in a position where you're not going to be able to use your ACT/SAT scores for early action, early decision. And if it's important to use to submit, and if it's important to use to submit the scores that you want that come from that December test, then then you should apply early, or you should apply regular. If not, then maybe not. But like that's another difference. I think those are the big differences between early and regular in terms of the net impact of them. You know, if you're applying to say 20 schools, I'd say, you know, if you apply to say 8 or 9 of them early action, if there are that many on your list that offer early action, that would be, you'd be in a very good position there. Okay, let me just briefly talk about early decision. I don't have a separate slide for early decision, early decision 2, but so early decision 2 is kind of the best of both worlds, right? In the sense that you get an advantage, there's an application advantage that's similar to the application advantage that you get from early decision 1. Not quite as big, but you still get an application advantage. And yet you can wait to submit until January 1st. So early decision 2 application deadline is the same as it is for regular decision. And so there's really not, so there's a lot to be said for early decision 2. Most of the students who apply early decision 1 will then, a lot of students will then apply early decision 2, take their chances, see what happens. I would say that the early decision 2 net advantage is probably closer to like 1.3 or 1.4 to 1. So the early decision 2 is sort of right in the middle between early action and regular decision in terms of the advantage that it confers. Part of it is that for early decision 2, there's this expectation that they know that you got denied by your early decision 1 school. So what that means is that the quality of the applicant pool for certain schools might be a little bit lower than it might be for early decision, which actually might be a good thing. But the admissions difference is the gross difference is pretty large. Early decision 2. So those are the big things. I mean, I think that the most important part of this is the part of it that the early decision advantage is much slimmer than is typically perceived. It's still a dramatic difference, but it's not anything like a 2 to 3. It's not anything like a 3 to 1 difference, or even a 2.5 to 1 difference. Does anyone have questions? I guess I went through this pretty quickly, but anybody have any questions or thoughts about any of this? Because if not, we can end a little bit early. And I appreciate everybody coming, and look forward to seeing you guys in the program and to thinking about these questions with you guys, because these are important questions. They're important questions to think through really at the end of junior year and beginning of senior year when you're narrowing your list down primarily. That's like the sort of time to really think it through.
Sorry.
All right, guys, thanks so much for coming, and I will talk to you guys soon.
Sorry, I have one.
Unless anybody has any questions.
I have a question.
All right. Thanks, guys.
No.
Oh, question. Yes.
But you
Yes.
can't hear me.
Sylvia?
Not sure why you can't hear me. Can you hear me?
Oh. Is there a question in the chat? Okay, let's see here. Okay, so here the question here is, for ED, what if you can't afford? Yeah, so there's a scholarship implication. So for ED, what do you do if you can't, if you apply? Okay, this is an interesting question. So what do you do if you apply early decision and then you discover that you can't afford it, or you don't get the financial aid package that you expect? Okay, well, if you apply early decision and you don't get the financial aid package that you expect, or you don't have, there's a shortfall or a decline in such a way that you're not able to afford it, then you can get out of the agreement. There are very few justifiable reasons for breaking the early decision rule. That is, affordability is one of them. So if you're in a position where your finances have changed and finances preclude you from being in a position to afford the school, then that is an acceptable reason, and actually you've got nothing to worry about. Now there's a second part, which is that a lot of people perceive it to be the case that applying early is going to hurt you on the financial aid side. Well, so it's interesting, because I think that that almost has to be true. But statistically, statistically, it has actually appeared that I mean, the statistics that I've seen have actually suggested that you get about the same package, whether you apply early or you apply regular. Some of that is because of the fact that the policies dictate the financial aid. So the need-based financial aid is going to be dictated by policies as opposed to something that they can make up as they go along in any kind of ad hoc way. So they can't break their own rules, right? So then we talk about something like merit. Well, in merit for early decision, merit-based, you're going to have it's going to be tougher to get a really good merit-based scholarship, probably early decision, than it would be regular decision. I haven't seen the statistics on merit-based scholarships, but that would almost self-evidently be the case. A lot of the schools that have early decision, or some of them at least, don't have big merit scholarship opportunities. So it might not be a big issue. But most of the colleges that we're looking at or talking about are going to be at the need level, are going to be need blind anyway, and are going to have policies that will not change the financial aid possibilities based on whether you apply early or regular. So that actually should have no impact at the need-based level. At the merit-based level, it might. But if it's simply a matter of affordability, that's a conversation you can have with the admissions committee, and that's a conversation topic that they are absolutely happy to. I mean, they're not going to be happy to, but they're willing to let that, to countenance that, and allow you to get out of the agreement. Okay, so here's another question, which is, if you have bad grades junior year, does that mean you should apply RD? There's a lot of discussion about this, and a lot of people would argue. I mean, there's a big argument that people make. I think a lot of people make about this issue, that if your grades are low freshman through junior year, that you wait and you apply regular. Well, I mean, I think there are a few arguments. There are a few arguments against that. So one argument against that is that your early decision colleges are going to get your mid-semester reports anyway. So before you are admitted, so they're going to get your quarter reports. The second argument against it is that you've already had 6 semesters behind you. So you already have had, 85 to 86% of your grades are already in the books. So unless we're talking about the difference between C's and straight A's, it's not going to make a huge difference in your actual GPA. In fact, most people are shocked. I mean, the difference between having if you have a 3.5 and then you get a 4.0 your last semester, I mean, the GPA shift or change in that your overall GPA is negligible. I mean, maybe it goes from a 3.5 to a 3.6. I mean, that's not negligible, but maybe 3.58. I don't know. It's not a major increase. The advantage of applying early is probably greater. Early decision. The advantage of applying early decision is probably greater than the advantage that you could get from a higher GPA in most cases. Early action, it's a closer call. But I mean, remember, there's a lot of uncertainty involved in that. You're banking on the fact that you're going to get into these better schools, or that you're going to get these better grades. But what if you don't, right? What if you're planning to have a higher GPA than you did last semester, but what if the circumstances don't conspire in such a way as to make that happen? I mean, I think if you know that you're going to get higher grades, then it probably nets about even with early action, but probably still would get an advantage early decision. Well, okay, so there's a final question here, and then we probably should run, which is about when should you use ACT, SAT scores for early decision, early action? I think the same guidance really applies for early decision and early action as would apply for regular decision, which is that if you are above the 25th percentile for a given college, you should submit scores. If you're not above the 25th percentile, then you should not submit scores. So they have the 25th to 75th band. If you are somewhere in that range between the 25th and 75th percentile, submit scores. If you're not, then it's probably not worth submitting scores. There are some extenuating circumstances around the politics of this. So legacy students, minority students from families that first generation college students, where you might actually be more likely to not want to submit. But for the most part, the 25th percentile is really where that threshold gets drawn. All right. Thanks so much, guys. Appreciate it. And I'm glad we had some questions. These were really pretty thought-provoking questions and compelling. And unless there are any other questions, I will look forward to seeing you guys soon. All right. Thanks so much, guys.